So just yesterday, my wife and I finally had the talk. Now, the talk is different from one person to another, from one couple to another. And I think this talk is all-encompassing, depending on where you are in your life. And I believe that life is a series of talks. You are going to have certain conversations that are very important to the nature of where you're going and what ultimately culminates to the biggest conversation, which is legacy. So she essentially said to me that we are not young anymore. We're getting old. This is after a typical day of work made me a little bit more tired than it would have done so a couple of years ago. And so as I just turned 34, for the first time, big conversations are starting to come up, which are, you are actually old. You are older than you think you are. And sometimes we think we are still 20 and we can do the things that we used to do when we were 20. But as you're getting older, you start realizing that your body is changing. And so we need to eat right. We need to work out more. We need to do all of these things more because we don't have the body of a 20-year-old anymore. And that conversation was very important for me. It shifted how I thought about a lot of things because the dominant issue for me became legacy. As men get older in their life, we shift from thinking about life in a linear fashion, but more to thinking about life in what is the legacy that I'm leaving behind? And I think that this conversation, even though it's important in life in terms of our wealth, what are we leaving to our children, and what is my legacy as a person? What are people going to say about me when I die? All of that stuff is absolutely important. However, I want to ask that question of you in a much broader sense, in that, are you a lesson or are you a cautionary tale? Can people look at you and say your Christianity, your walk with God was exemplary? Or are they going to look at you and say, don't be like that person? And I think ultimately that becomes the biggest thing. I know many people who started well, who started serving God faithfully, who were in church, who helped many people, who served, who loved, who did everything they could do. They were sacrificial. Their lives were exemplary. And we could look at them and they were the example that was set, the standard that was set for us. But years later, knowing those same people, I'm ashamed. I don't know what happened to them. Their stories ended up in a profoundly sad way because ultimately they are now a cautionary tale. Jesus reminds us of this when he tells us that be faithful to the end. It's important not only to be faithful for now or for a moment or a season, but to be faithful until the very end, when our lives are weighed and they are put on a scale. And ultimately when people see us, they see that God was at work. You started with God and you finished with God. And that whole journey is a journey of a legacy of faith. Even when Paul is speaking to Timothy, he reminds him of the legacy of faith left by his mother and his grandmother. There are certain things that I wish I could leave to my children, but most importantly, I think the greatest thing I can give them is a walk with God, a pure, true walk with God. And so I'm asking myself all these questions after that conversation, after the talk we had. I'm asking myself conversations of what is my legacy? And I think that the greatest legacy we can ever leave beyond what we do on what we preach, what we share on YouTube, and what is maybe one of the biggest driving forces for me for doing this channel is I want my kids to look at this material in 10 years, in 20 years, and I want it to shape who they are. And so one of the things that I do as a matter of focus is I realize this is so much bigger than me, but I want them to go to a source that will give them information in their walk with God, in the legacy that I leave behind for them, that will shape how they know God, how they experience God, even when I'm no longer there. And so this is why this is important for me. So I want to ask you, in your walk with God, what is your legacy? Do you recognize that you've been a Christian for so long, or you're a new Christian just starting your walk with God? What kind of legacy do you want to leave behind in the walk that you're having with God? And how are you realizing that legacy?